There is a small clay tablet sitting under gallery light somewhere in the world right now. It is not large. You could hold it in one hand without effort. The surface is pale, worn at the edges, and the marks pressed into it are shallow, just barely deeper than the surrounding clay, like the faint impression a fingernail leaves in soft bread. And yet those marks are still there. Still readable, in some sense, by the right eyes. Still counting something that once mattered to someone who is long gone. Tonight, we're starting with something a little different. This is not a story about kings. It is not about war, or conquest, or the kinds of events that get carved in stone and placed in palace courtyards. This is something quieter than that. It is about the ordinary business of keeping records in a world made of mud, and about how that quiet, ordinary practice turned into one of the most significant things human beings have ever done. The tablet you are imagining should not have survived. Clay is fragile. It dissolves in rain. It cracks in heat. It returns to earth over centuries, and the earth in southern Mesopotamia is not the dry kind that preserves things neatly. It is damp alluvial soil, the kind that rivers lay down in layers, the kind that smells faintly of water even in dry months. A small administrative tablet, left outside, would be gone in a generation. But it didn't. And here you are, thousands of years later, in a quiet room, about to listen to a story about what those tablets contain. Before we go any further, if you are settling in for the night, this is a good moment to get comfortable. Pull the covers a little closer if you need to. You don't have to do anything tonight except rest. If this kind of quiet history helps you sleep, a like on the video or a subscription to the channel means a great deal. It helps more people find their way here on evenings like this one. And if you feel like leaving a comment in the morning, just mention where in the world you are listening from. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing how far this reaches. Now, let's begin. The tablet is still there. Cool, dry, slightly rough at the edges where the clay contracted as it hardened. The marks on the surface are pressed into rows. Not painted, not scratched, but pressed, a small stylus pushed into the wet surface in quick, deliberate movements. The person doing this was not thinking about history. They were thinking about grain, or livestock, or a count of workers who needed to be fed. The tablet was a working document, not a monument. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The earliest writing we know of was not poetry. It was not prayer. It was not the telling of stories, those stories came later. The first writing was accounting. It was lists. It was the careful, practical business of keeping track of things in a world where keeping track of things had become complicated enough to require a new technology. Southern Mesopotamia, in the period when writing first appears, is flat country. Low, wide, intersected by rivers and canals. The soil is rich because the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, have been depositing silt across it for longer than settled human life has existed. There are no mountains nearby. No quarries. No natural stone to speak of. What there is, in abundance, is clay. Clay along the riverbanks. Clay underfoot in the reed-fringed lowlands. Clay in the walls of every house and storehouse and courtyard, shaped into bricks, dried in the sun, stacked and restacked and built up into the modest skylines of early cities. And where there is abundant clay, the idea of pressing marks into it is not a great leap. You are already building with it, shaping it, smoothing it. The step from that to pressing a pointed reed into a flat surface and recording a number, that step makes sense in this landscape in a way it might not elsewhere. The material was simply there. This is the kind of place where writing became practical. Not inevitable, but logical, given the conditions. The landscape almost invites it. For a while, this is simply how life was organized. The canal systems were old by the time the earliest tablets appeared. Water management in this region, diverting river flow, maintaining channels, irrigating fields at a distance from the main rivers, required coordination that went well beyond what a single household or village could manage. There were storehouses. Centralized collection points where grain came in from surrounding fields, was measured and recorded, and went back out again as rations, seed stock, or trade goods. Workers moved between tasks. Animals were borrowed and returned. Fields were apportioned and harvested and counted. The logistics of all of this had quietly outgrown the capacity of human memory alone. The tablets were not invented in one moment by one person. They emerged from a practical need that had been building for some time, a need to remember, accurately, across time, things that memory alone could not reliably hold. A record you could hold in your hand and set down in an archive and come back to later. A number that did not shift depending on who was telling it. There are hundreds of thousands of tablets now in museum collections around the world. Most of them are administrative. Ration lists, animal counts, field measurements, names followed by numbers, totals. A few tablets contain exercises, the work of students learning to write, copying lists of standard words and signs. A smaller number contain what look like literary texts, hymns, myths, proverbs, instructions. But even those, scholars often note, were preserved because they were used in scribal schools as practice material. They were copied out not because someone wanted to preserve great literature but because copying complex texts was how a student learned to control a stylus. What this means is that everything we know about ordinary Sumerian life, the rhythms of work, the organization of labor, the distribution of food, the structure of households and institutions, has come to us through the administrative record. Not through personal accounts. Not through private letters, for the most part, though some of those exist from later periods. Mostly through the quiet residue of institutional life. The lists, the counts, the tallies, the carefully noted transfers of goods from one place to another. The scholars who work with these tablets spend years, sometimes careers, on a single archive. They learn to read the cuneiform signs, which changed and developed over centuries, and they work out what a given sign means in context, what the numbers refer to, how the system functioned. Much of this is still being worked out. The tablets are not fully translated. The language of the earliest period is only partially understood. There are gaps. There are signs whose meaning is still debated. The picture is real, but it is also incomplete, and the people working on it are honest about that. What they can say is this: these were real people. Not imagined figures. Not symbols of a civilization. People who moved through mornings that felt like mornings, who got tired, who measured things carefully because accuracy mattered in their work, who sometimes made errors and had to correct them. The tablets do not give us their inner lives. But they give us the texture of a world that was organized, functional, and quietly complex, and that is something. Meanwhile, life carried on quietly in the alluvial lowlands, in ways the tablets record without quite explaining. There are presences in this record. Not quite personalities, but traces. An administrator who appears repeatedly in one archive, authorizing the movement of grain over several years. A name that shows up in an apprentice list and then, a decade later, in a more senior position. A worker receiving a slightly different ration, perhaps because of age or skill, or some category of status the tablets note without explaining. You can feel the outlines of lives without being able to fill them in. And that feeling, of proximity without full access, is one of the quieter aspects of working with this material. The tablet under the gallery light holds some of that. It is not a dramatic object. It does not look like treasure. It looks like what it is, a small piece of clay with marks pressed into it by someone who was trying to keep something straight. And it survived not because anyone thought it was important, but because it was stored in the right place at the right time, and the right kind of accident, a fire, perhaps, that baked it hard, or simply a sealed room that kept the moisture out, preserved it while everything else dissolved. It belongs to a system. A much larger system of counting and storage and obligation that spread across dozens of sites and several centuries and produced, as a kind of unintended consequence, one of the most enduring bodies of written material from the ancient world. That system had its center, in the earliest period, in a city that grew up at the edge of the alluvial plain, where the rivers were close and the clay was deep and the storehouses were large. The first workrooms where all of this began were not grand places. These early workrooms were purely functional. Low ceilings, probably. Thick mud brick walls that kept the interior cool even in the warmest months. The air in a room like that would have smelled of damp earth and dry reed and something faintly mineral, the smell of fresh clay left out on a flat surface to be worked. There would have been shelves, or something like shelves. Rows of finished tablets drying in sequence. Baskets near the walls. The sounds from outside would have come in muffled, footsteps on packed earth, the movement of goods, the low noise of a large settlement going about its business. This is Uruk, in the broad window of time that scholars place somewhere between roughly 5,500 and 5,000 years ago. The city, or what we now call a city, had grown considerably larger than most settlements in the region at that time. Large enough that its storehouses required a kind of organized memory that individual minds could not hold reliably on their own. large enough that goods moved through its administrative spaces in quantities that needed to be fixed in writing, not because anyone had decided to invent something new, but because the alternative was confusion, and confusion was expensive. You can picture yourself standing just outside one of those workrooms. The ground underfoot is dry on the surface but yields slightly under pressure, a mix of packed earth and old clay debris, the compressed residue of years of daily activity. The doorway is low. Inside, the light comes mostly from what enters through the opening, falling in a flat angle across the work surfaces. Someone is already at a table, or its nearest equivalent. A piece of fresh clay is being pressed flat with the heel of a hand. The surface smooths quickly. Then a stylus, a cut reed, angled at one end, is pressed into it, once, then again, leaving a narrow wedge-shaped mark each time. The motion is quick and practiced. Not hesitant. Not ceremonial. It is the motion of someone doing a task they have done many times before, in the same sequence, with the same materials. The sounds are soft, a faint press, a brief drag, another press. And then the tablet is set aside to dry. What it records, most likely, is something entirely practical. A quantity of grain received from a particular source. A count of workers assigned to a task. The movement of containers from one storage area to another. The kind of information that, if lost, would require someone to remember it correctly and report it correctly and agree with someone else's memory of it correctly, which, in a settlement of this scale, was no longer a reliable process. Over time, this became the foundation that everything else was built on. The marks pressed into these early Uruk tablets are what specialists call proto-cuneiform. The signs are still largely pictographic in character. Some of them are recognizable as simplified outlines of the things they represent. A head, a hand, a jar shape, a container. Others are more abstract, representing quantities or categories rather than objects. The system was functional before it was elegant. It recorded what it needed to record, and it did not spend much effort on anything else. What it tracked, in the earliest period, was primarily this: goods in, goods out. Workers present, workers absent. Quantities measured, totals reached. The tablets from Uruk's earliest administrative layer are, in the most straightforward sense, the records of a large institution managing large flows of material. Grain moved through those storehouses in significant quantities. Animals were counted and allocated. Containers were standardized so that measures could be compared across different transactions. The need for consistency produced its own kind of discipline. The clay was pressed. The goods were counted. The totals held still after the voices faded. This matters because it changes the way you think about why writing exists at all. The intuitive assumption is that writing begins when someone wants to tell a story, or preserve a thought, or communicate across distance. And writing does eventually do all of those things. But in this place, in this period, it begins earlier and more quietly than that, as a technology for stabilizing information that would otherwise drift. A record that does not depend on who is remembering it, or what mood they are in, or whether they were present at the original transaction. A fixed point in a world of moving goods and shifting personnel. There is something almost reassuring about that. Writing begins not as an act of ambition but as a practical solution to a practical problem. The ambition came later. What the tablets do not tell us, at this early stage, is much about the people who made them. The signs record quantities and categories. They do not record names in the way later cuneiform does. They do not record speech, or reasoning, or personal identity in any direct sense. They are administrative in the most stripped-back meaning of the word, designed to hold information stable across time and between people, without any of the elaboration that would eventually make cuneiform capable of recording literature. There is also a layer of genuine uncertainty here that scholars are careful about. The relationship between these earliest Uruk tablets and the Sumerian language as it is understood from later, more readable texts is not entirely direct. The proto-cuneiform system records categories and quantities in a way that does not map cleanly onto spoken grammar. It is not clear, in the earliest examples, that the signs are recording words in the way that later cuneiform clearly does. Whether these tablets represent the Sumerian language specifically, or a more general administrative notation that preceded any single language being fixed in writing, is something scholars still treat with appropriate caution. What can be said is that the institution behind the tablets was real. The goods were real. The labor was real. The counting was real. Whatever language those who worked in those rooms spoke among themselves, the clay held the numbers. Meanwhile, the city itself continued to grow around those workrooms. Uruk in this period was not a small settlement. It was, by the standards of its time and region, extraordinarily large. Its population, reconstructed from site surveys and archaeological evidence, was significant enough to require organized food distribution on a scale that smaller communities did not face. The canal infrastructure that fed its surrounding agricultural land was maintained collectively. The storage facilities within its institutional core were built and rebuilt over time, their architecture reflecting the practical need to hold large quantities of grain, oil, and other goods in stable, accessible conditions. The institution at the center of this, and scholars debate exactly how to characterize it, whether as a temple-based administration or something more complex, functioned essentially as the organizing body that kept the city's resources moving. Goods came in from the surrounding agricultural land. They were received, measured, recorded, and redistributed as rations to workers, as allocations to various activities, as stock for future seasons. The administrative tablets were the connective tissue of this system. Without them, the institution could not have operated at this scale. With them, it could track obligations, correct discrepancies, and plan across time in a way that purely oral coordination could not have managed. The clay was pressed again. Another tablet was set to dry. The room remained quiet. There is something in the sheer repetition of this, the daily, unremarkable practice of pressing marks into clay to record ordinary quantities, that makes it feel less like the birth of civilization and more like the development of a particularly useful habit. Habits accumulate. They become infrastructure. They outlast the people who formed them. And in this case, the habit of recording things in clay outlasted almost everything else about the world that produced it. The institutions changed. The city's influence shifted. The people who pressed those earliest marks are entirely anonymous to us now. But the tablets remained. And gradually, over the centuries that followed, the system grew more capable. The signs became more numerous. The categories they could express grew more varied. The relationship between sign and spoken word became closer and more direct. Writing, which had begun as a way to hold numbers still, slowly became a way to hold language still, and with language, eventually, came everything else. Stories. Prayers, as the Sumerians understood them. Instructions. Arguments. Lists of kings. Laments for fallen cities. But none of that arrives quickly. It arrives in the way that most durable things arrive, gradually, through use, through repetition, through a long succession of ordinary days in which someone pressed clay and recorded what needed to be recorded and set the tablet aside to dry. The counting rooms of Uruk fed into something larger than counting. And that larger world, the one where barley and beer and labor and the quiet routines of daily institutional life become legible in far more human detail, was already taking shape in the archives of cities that came after, and alongside, and in the long shadow of what Uruk had quietly started. And that larger world did take shape. Slowly, and in the most ordinary way imaginable, through the accumulation of records about the things people needed every day to stay alive and keep working. Barley was the center of almost everything. In the archives that survive from sites like Uruk and later from the cities of Umma, Girsu, and the great collection point at Pusris Dagan, barley appears more often than any other single commodity. It was grain for bread, yes, but it was also the raw material for beer, which was not a luxury in this world but a staple, a caloric, preserved, relatively safe liquid that workers received as part of their regular allocation. A ration of barley and a ration of beer, recorded together on the same tablet, represents a meal. Represents a day. Represents someone showing up and being counted and receiving what the institution determined they were owed. The tablets from the Ur III period, roughly from the last century of the 3rd millennium BCE, are among the richest surviving administrative records from the ancient world. There are tens of thousands of them. They come from multiple cities and cover decades of institutional routine. They are dated, many of them, with the year, the month, and sometimes the day. This makes them archival in a very particular sense. They are not just records, they are timed records, layered one on top of another into a slow, steady official rhythm of delivery, audit, and movement through institutional time. What you are reading, when you read these tablets, is the cadence of an organized system. Grain entered. Beer was allocated. Animals were counted. Wool was bundled and recorded by weight. Boats moved along canals carrying loads that were noted at departure and checked on arrival. The same categories recur across seasons and across years, and the repetition is itself a kind of information. It tells you that this system was stable, that it ran on routine, that its participants knew what to expect from one allocation period to the next. For a while, this was simply how people moved through their days. The role types visible in these records are important to notice, because they are as close as the archive comes to introducing actual people. Laboris appear as counted groups assigned to particular tasks: clearing canals, moving loads, working land during harvest. Herders are named in relation to the animals they were responsible for. The count of sheep and goats entrusted to a particular person's care appears periodically in the record, and any discrepancy between what was expected and what was returned needed to be accounted for. Brewers appear as specialists within the institutional economy, producing beer from allocated barley at a known yield. Boatmen appear when goods needed to move. Craft workers appear in relation to materials issued to them and finished goods expected in return. These are not portraits. They are positions. What survives is the institutional trace of a person, the moment when they intersect with a system that needed to record something about them. A name followed by a quantity. A title followed by a number. The record does not tell you what that person thought about their work, or whether they were tired that afternoon, or whether they had eaten. It tells you what they received, or what was assigned to them, or what they were responsible for returning. And yet there is something in even this thin trace. A name that appears across multiple tablets over several years means a continuous working life, even if the tablets only capture moments of transaction. A herder whose animals are counted and found complete across a long audit period was, in some sense, reliable. That reliability is recorded even if it is not celebrated. A laborer who appears first in a general group and later as a named individual receiving a slightly different ration has moved, in some way, through the system. The archive does not explain any of this. It simply holds the surface of it. The goods themselves accumulate into a picture of daily institutional life. Oil was issued in small measures for lamps or for food or both. Flour appeared alongside barley as a processed alternative for certain purposes. Animals moved between cities as part of large coordinated deliveries, a practice especially visible at Pusris Dagan, which scholars understand as a centralized holding and distribution point for animals drawn from across the Or3 state and then redistributed to various institutional recipients. Textiles were produced in workshops where women and children appear in the record as part of organized labor, their output measured by weight and logged against materials issued. Wool, in particular, carried through the archive with a quiet regularity. It was sheared, weighed, and allocated to weavers. The finished cloth was measured and received. Deficits were noted. Supervisors were named. The whole process moved from animal to finished textile through a chain of recorded steps, each one pressed into clay at the point of transfer. The result is that the economic life of a textile workshop, which would otherwise be entirely invisible to us, is legible in outline, if not in detail, from the surviving tablets. Meanwhile, the land itself continued to produce, season by season, in the background of all of this. Fields were measured and recorded. Their expected yields were calculated based on area and crop type. At harvest, what was actually gathered was compared against those expectations, and the difference, whether surplus or shortfall, entered the record. Irrigation determined everything in this landscape. Water from the canals had to reach each field at the right time and in the right quantity, and maintaining that system required organized labor that was itself recorded and compensated through the same allocation networks. The canal, the field, the harvest, the storehouse, the tablet, they formed a single connected chain, and the archive holds the marks of every link. What the archive does not hold is the texture of experience within that chain. This is the honest limit of the evidence, and it is worth naming clearly. These records preserve structure. They preserve the surface of a managed system, what moved, what was counted, what was approved, what was received. But the inner life of the system, the way it felt to be a laborer assigned to canal work in the heat of a summer month, or a brewer whose output was slightly below the expected yield and who had to explain that discrepancy to a supervisor, none of that is recorded. The tablets were not designed to hold it. They were designed to hold numbers, and numbers are what survived. There is a question embedded in this, a quiet one that grows the longer you spend with these archives. When a record is close enough to a person to name them, to assign them, to measure what they produced and compare it against what they owed, how close is that, really, to the person themselves? The answer is that it is close and also not close at all. The archive brings us to the edge of ordinary life in this world and stops there, at the boundary between the measurable and the merely lived. This is not a failure of the archive. It did exactly what it was built to do. But it means that what we know of the brawers and the herders and the weavers and the boatmen of the Year 3 period is always filtered through the needs of the institution that recorded them. They appear when they are assigned. They appear when they are counted. They appear when they receive something, or owe something, or are found to be present or absent. Beyond those moments, the record is silent. And yet those moments add up. Across tens of thousands of tablets and several decades of institutional operation, they add up into something that feels, at a distance, like the outlines of a functioning world. A world where grain arrived each autumn and was stored and then moved outward through the year in measured portions. Where animals grazed somewhere outside the city and were periodically driven in and counted and reassigned. Where cloth was produced in large organized workshops and sent to recipients whose names were written down on the day of delivery. Where boats moved along canals whose names appear in the tablets as casually as street names might appear in a modern delivery record. All of this required people who knew how to read and write the signs. Not every worker in the system needed that knowledge, most did not have it. But for the archive to function, for the tablets to be made and stored and consulted and corrected and continued over years and decades, there had to be a steady supply of people trained to use cuneiform accurately and consistently. And training people to write cuneiform was not a simple or incidental matter. It was a serious undertaking, conducted in dedicated spaces, over long periods, according to methods that left their own traces in the archaeological record. For the archive to continue, someone had to learn it first, sign by sign, in whatever room was set aside for that purpose. In the case of early Sumerian writing, we know something about what that room looked like, what happened inside it, and what it felt like to sit there through a long morning of copying the same signs again and again until they came out right. The evidence for scribal schooling comes primarily from a later period than the archives of Year 3. The school tablets that survive in large numbers, the practice exercises, the copied model texts, the vocabulary lists pressed into small palm-sized pieces of clay, belong mostly to the Old Babylonian period, a broad stretch of time running roughly from the early 2nd millennium down to around 1600 years before the Common Era. Nippur is the city most associated with this material. Your produced school tablets as well. Other sites have yielded smaller collections. But Nippur, in particular, left behind a record of scribal education that scholars have spent generations working through, and it gives us something the administrative archive cannot, a sense of the room itself. The rooms were not large. Excavations have turned up what appear to be small domestic or semi-domestic settings repurposed for teaching, spaces within ordinary mud brick structures where the ceiling was low and the light came in filtered and indirect through a single opening. There were no grand halls of learning here, no monumental architecture dedicated to the written word. The school was wherever the schoolmaster worked, and the schoolmaster worked in modest conditions with modest equipment. A flat surface for the clay. A jar or basket nearby where discarded practice tablets could be stored or reprocessed. A model tablet, the teacher's version, set beside the student's fresh piece of clay so the shapes could be compared directly. The scratch of a reed stylus, repeated. The soft resistance of damp clay. The small sound of a tablet being set down. The process of learning cuneiform in this tradition was not quick. It began with the most basic elements, the wedge shapes themselves, pressed into clay in different orientations to produce the foundational marks from which all signs were assembled. A student spent real time on this before advancing. The goal was not speed but consistency, the ability to press a sign the same way each time, at the correct angle, with the correct depth, in a form that matched the model. This is harder than it sounds when the material is soft clay and the tool is a cut reed and the signs number in the hundreds. From basic sign formation, the student moved into lists. Long, ordered lists of words grouped by category, names of animals, names of trees, names of objects, names of professions. These lexical lists were not invented fresh for each classroom. They were inherited compositions, passed down through generations of scribal training, copied and recopied until they became standard reference material. A student who memorized and could accurately reproduce these lists had absorbed not just vocabulary but a way of organizing the world, the same categorical framework that the administrative archive used when it labeled a worker as a herder or a brewer or a boatman. Over time, this became the architecture of scribal memory. The lists grew more complex as training advanced. Metrological lists, organized sequences of weights, measures, areas, and capacities, trained the student in the numerical and quantitative language of institutional life. These were practical tools. A scribe who could not work fluently with standard measures was not equipped to produce the kind of tablets the archive required. So the lists were not abstract exercises. They were preparation for the actual work that waited at the end of training. What makes the Nippur material particularly interesting is that it preserves not only the exercises but also something of the culture around them. There is a composition known among scholars as school days, a literary text that presents a student's day from morning arrival through the various lessons and corrections and minor mishaps of classroom life. Scholars are careful about this text. It is not a diary. It is not a transcript of one verified historical morning. It is a literary composition shaped by its own conventions and educational ideals, and it tells us as much about how Babylonian culture imagined and valued scribal training as it does about any single real classroom. But it is also not invented from nothing. The details it contains, the model tablet, the older student assigned to help younger ones, the schoolmaster's authority, the importance of accuracy and posture and attendance, these match the physical evidence of the tablets themselves closely enough to be taken seriously as a reflection of genuine educational practice. The Amir, the schoolmaster, is the central authority in this world. Not a dramatic figure in the surviving texts, but a consistent presence, the one who set the model, corrected the copy, determined when a student's work was acceptable and when it needed to be done again. The relationship between Amir and student was not sentimental. It was functional. The student was there to learn a craft, and the craft had standards, and the standards were enforced through repetition and correction rather than explanation or encouragement. You copied until the copy matched. Then you moved to the next thing and copied that. Meanwhile, the discarded exercises accumulated quietly in the corner. Broken tablets, imperfect copies, practice pieces deemed unworthy of keeping, these were recycled back into new clay or simply stored in pits and jars that archaeologists later found intact. This is one of the reasons the school record survived at all. Discarded exercises were not treated as waste in the way a modern piece of paper might be thrown away and decomposed. Clay that was stored simply remained. And when a building fell or a site was abandoned, the stored clay stayed where it was, waiting under accumulating layers of soil for the excavator's brush. The student who filled those jars with imperfect copies was not thinking about the future of Sumerian literature. That student was thinking about getting the sign right, about matching the model closely enough to be allowed to move forward. The preservation was accidental. The durability of the material did the work that no one planned. What the school tablets preserve, beyond the evidence of training, is something larger and harder to name. By the Old Babylonian period, Sumerian as a living spoken language was fading, or had already faded in most regions. Akkadian had become the dominant spoken language across much of Mesopotamia. And yet Sumerian continued to be taught, copied, and preserved in the scribal schools, not because it was needed for daily administrative work, but because it carried prestige. Because the old texts were valuable. Because a trained scribe who could read and write Sumerian was more accomplished than one who could not. This is how a language outlasts the people who once spoke it naturally. Not through heroic effort or deliberate preservation projects, but through the quiet institutional decision that it remained worth learning. The school copied it because the school had always copied it. The student pressed those signs into clay because that was what students did. And through that repetitive, unglamorous, largely unintentional process, the Sumerian literary tradition, the hymns, the proverbs, the myths, the laments, survived into periods that would otherwise have had no access to it at all. The relationship between the school and the archive, when you see it clearly, is not separate at all. The archive required trained scribes. Trained scribes came from the school. The school taught Sumerian partly because Sumerian was the prestige language of the archive's oldest traditions. The archive preserved Sumerian because the school kept producing people who could read it. Each one sustained the other across centuries, not through any grand plan, but through the simple continuity of practice. A student copied a sign. The sign dried. The tablet joined the others in the room. The schoolmaster set a new model. The next morning, the reed was picked up again. And somewhere in that long, slow accumulation of copied signs and dried clay and corrected exercises, the question shifts. Because once you have the archive and the school together, the records of daily institutional life and the tradition of scribal training that produced the people who made those records, what you are left with is a very particular kind of window into an ordinary life. A window that shows you the edges of a room, the surface of a table, the marks on a tablet. That shows you the categories a person belonged to, the goods they received, the signs they learned to press into clay. But that stops, consistently, just short of the interior. Just short of the day as it was actually experienced from the inside, by a person who woke up that morning and went through it without knowing they were living inside something scholars would one day call history. That gap between the record and the life is what all of this material, taken together, quietly and persistently opens up. That gap between the record and the life is the most honest place to stand when you try to reconstruct what an ordinary day in this world actually felt like. Not inside the archive, and not outside it, but right at its edge, where the numbers stop and the person continues. And yet standing there, you can assemble something. Not a diary, not a personal account, not anything that speaks in a first-person voice about what a morning felt like from the inside. But something. A texture. A slow accumulation of repeated detail that adds up, across thousands of tablets and centuries of consistent practice, into a recognizable shape of daily life. The day would have started early, in the way that days start early in agricultural landscapes where water management determines everything and the cooler hours are too valuable to waste. The canals were most active in the morning. Reed boats moved along them while the air was still damp and the light was low and flat across the water. Those boats were carrying things, grain, perhaps, or a load of finished goods moving from one institutional point to another. The boatman handling the vessel appears in the record only as a name and a cargo and a destination. The record does not note whether the water was still that morning or whether there was a wind coming off the plain. It records the load and the movement and the arrival. The rest is silence. In the storerooms, work had already begun. Jars were being tallied, containers counted, incoming goods measured against expected quantities. The smell of stored grain in a mud brick room is distinctive, dry and slightly dusty, with something faintly sweet underneath. The sound of measuring is quiet, the scrape of a container against a stone floor, the soft rush of grain poured from one vessel to another, the brief pause while someone counts and recounts to be sure. Then the stylus touches the clay, and the number is fixed. What's easy to forget is that these moments were not significant to the people living them. They were routine. That is precisely what makes them useful to us now, not their importance, but their ordinariness. A record that was created once, for a special occasion, might tell us something about ceremony. A record that was created every day, week after week, season after season, tells us something about the texture of regular life. The ration lists matter because they were boring. The delivery receipts matter because they were expected. The repetition is the point. Over time, the pattern of a life inside these institutions becomes dimly legible. A laborer in this world moved between tasks according to assignment. Canal clearance in the dry months, field preparation before planting, harvest work in the appropriate season. The record tracks these movements not as biographical events but as administrative facts, this person, this task, this allocation. What the record cannot track is the weight of tiredness at the end of a long canal work day, or the particular satisfaction of a task completed before the heat became unbearable, or the small social rhythms of people working in groups, the brief rest under a reed shelter, the shared water jar, the conversation that left no trace anywhere. That conversation is gone. Not suppressed, not hidden, simply never recorded, because the systems that generated these tablets were not designed to hold that kind of information. They were designed to hold quantities and categories, and they did that with remarkable consistency over remarkable spans of time. The brewer's day is slightly more visible than the laborious, because the brewing process generated its own chain of records. Barley in, beer out, yield noted, recipients logged. A brewer who consistently produced the expected yield from the allocated grain appears in the archive as reliable, even if the word reliable is never used. The numbers carry the judgment. And a brewer whose output fell short, because the grain was of poorer quality that season, or because something went wrong in the process, would have had to account for the difference somehow, and that accounting, if it entered the record, is the closest thing to a work problem that the archive preserves. The brewers were often women, as best as the tablets allow scholars to reconstruct. Women appear throughout the institutional record in various roles, as textile workers, as ration recipients, as names attached to specific categories of labor. The archive does not explain the social conditions of this. It records the institutional fact and moves on. The inner life of a woman working in a brewery within a large institution in the Year 3 period is not available to us. What is available is the record of the barley she received and the beer she was expected to produce from it. Meanwhile, in a room not far from the storehouses, clay was being prepared for the day's writing. The scribe's morning had its own rhythm, slightly different from the laborers and the brewers, but no less repetitive. Fresh clay had to be prepared to the right consistency, not too wet, not too dry, and formed into the appropriate tablet size for the day's work. A small tablet for a receipt. A larger tablet for a longer list or a more complex transaction. The stylus had to be clean and properly cut. The model, if one was being copied, had to be set in a position where it could be read and referenced without difficulty. Then the work began, and it was largely silent work, and it continued until the day's records were complete or the clay was exhausted. The truth is that most of what we call Sumerian daily life is a reconstruction built from the habits of these record keepers. The canal is real because the tablets mention boats and cargoes and destinations along named waterways. The storehouse is real because the tablets record what entered it and what left it. The brewery is real because the allocations of barley and the deliveries of finished beer form a consistent and repeated pattern. But the reconstruction is also, always, filtered through the priorities of the institution. What the institution did not need to record, it did not record. And what it did not record, we do not have. This is not a small limitation. The scribal record reveals a world organized around counting, storage, allocation, and oversight. It reveals the concerns of administrators and supervisors and trained writers. It shows us the surface of a society that was managing large flows of material across large numbers of people. What it does not show us is what that society thought about itself, outside the framework of those institutions. What an ordinary person understood their life to mean. What they told their children at the end of a long day. What they noticed and found worth noticing that the tablets had no category to hold. The school evidence adds something, but it adds it sideways. The lexical lists preserve a way of organizing the world, animals grouped by type, professions grouped by domain, objects grouped by material. This tells us something about how trained Babylonian scribes categorized experience. But it is not the same as knowing how an uneducated laborer or a canal worker or a ration recipient organized their own understanding of daily life. The school was not the whole of society. It was one particular, specialized corner of it, and its records reflect its own priorities at least as much as they reflect broader social reality. What scholars are careful to say, and what seems right, is that the archive brings us genuinely close to the structure of this world and genuinely close to its surface, and then stops. This closeness is real without being complete, and the incompleteness is not a problem to be solved but a condition to be understood. The day moved toward evening in the alluvial lowlands the way it always has in flat, open country, slowly, with the light flattening and the air cooling and the sounds of the city settling into something quieter. The canal traffic thinning. The courtyards emptying. The mud brick walls releasing the heat they had absorbed through the afternoon in long, gradual waves. Inside the storehouses, the tallies for the day had been completed and the clay was drying. Inside the scribal room, the last tablet had been set aside. Whatever remained undone would wait for the following morning, when the clay would be prepared again and the stylus picked up again and the record continued. There is something in the sheer persistence of this, the daily return to the same tasks, the same materials, the same careful record of ordinary quantities, that says something true about how most of human life has always been organized. Not around the exceptional. Around the repeated. Around the things that had to be done again because they had been done yesterday and would need to be done again tomorrow. The tablets preserved the repeated. And the repeated, accumulated across decades and centuries, is what we have. It is partial, it is filtered, and it is real. And it is quiet in the way that most actual life is quiet, not silent, but without the kind of noise that history usually remembers. The light was going down over the plain. The broken tablets in the corner jar held their totals, undisturbed. Somewhere in the settling city, the last counted jar had been sealed for the night, and the record of it was drying in the dark beside it, still holding the number, waiting for whoever came next to read it. The light was going down over the plain, and somewhere under the accumulating soil of centuries, the tablets were already beginning their long wait. Not preserved by intention. Not sealed in any deliberate archive meant to outlast the civilization that produced it. Just buried, gradually, under the slow collapse of mud brick walls and the patient layering of time. The city contracted. The institutions that had generated all those careful records eventually ceased to function in the forms they had held. The scribes who had pressed the signs moved on or died or trained students who trained other students in other places, and the specific rooms where the counting had happened became rubble, and the rubble became mounded earth, and the mounded earth sat quietly for thousands of years under the open sky of southern Mesopotamia. What was lost in that process is not a small thing, and we must acknowledge it honestly before anything else. The first and simplest loss is the unwritten dimension of every life that ever passed through those institutions. The tone of a voice. The sound of a household in the early morning before anyone had left for work. The particular way a person laughed, or went quiet when they were tired, or described something they had seen that day to someone who had not been there. None of that was ever pressed into clay. It was not the kind of thing the archive was designed to hold, and so it simply was not held. It dissolved with the people who carried it, as it always does, in every time and place. The Sumerian laborer and the Sumerian brewer and the Sumerian student pressing signs into practice clay, their inner lives departed with them entirely, and no amount of careful scholarship will recover what was never written down. The second loss is more specific to the archive itself. Even what was recorded did not all survive. Tablets broke. Edges crumbled. Lines became illegible. Entire archives were scattered through excavation, and pieces that once belonged to single documents ended up in different collections in different countries, separated by thousands of miles and rarely reunited even when scholars know they belong together. There are tablets whose signs are partially readable, whose totals are present but whose context has been lost because the surrounding material did not survive. There are names that appear once in a single roster and never again, people who existed, who were counted, who received something from a system that bothered to write their name down, and who are otherwise entirely unknown to us. The record held them for a moment and then lost them, and the moment is all that remains. And beyond the physical losses, there is the interpretive limit that runs through all of this material. What survived is a record of systems. It is not a record of how those systems were experienced from the inside, and the difference matters. The archive can tell us that a person received a ration. It cannot tell us whether they felt that ration was fair, or whether they resented the counting, or whether they simply accepted it as the condition of their days without ever thinking about it in those terms at all. The silence where that experience would be is permanent. It will not be filled by any future discovery, because the information was never created in a recoverable form. It lived in speech, in gesture, in the unremarkable texture of ordinary days, and it ended when those days ended. This is what was lost. It is considerable, and it is calm to say so. And yet, what survived is also considerable, and in some ways more surprising than the losses, because survival across this span of time, 4,000 years and more, for some of the earliest material, was never guaranteed and never easy. The administrative archive survived because clay is durable and because the accident of fire, which would have destroyed many other materials, actually hardened the tablets and preserved them against the damp. The school tablets survived because discarded exercises were stored rather than scattered, and stored clay outlasts almost everything else. The literary and lexical traditions survived because old Babylonian scribal schools kept copying them, generation after generation, not as acts of cultural heroism but as the ordinary practice of an educational system that had decided Sumerian remained worth knowing. The survival was not triumphant. It was repetitive, mundane, and accidental in equal measure, which is probably the only honest way that anything survives across that much time. What that survival gave us is the earliest large-scale record of organized daily life that exists anywhere in the written record. Not the most intimate record. Not the most personal. But the earliest durable evidence that human beings were managing complex systems of food, labor, water, education, and memory in a coordinated and sustained way, and that they were doing it through writing, through the quiet daily practice of pressing marks into clay and setting the result aside to dry. Over time, that record found its way into the hands of people who could begin to read it again. The excavations that uncovered the major sites of southern Mesopotamia began in the 19th century and continued through the 20th, and the tablets they brought to the surface went to museum collections across the world, to institutions in Philadelphia and New York, in London and Berlin and Baghdad, in Paris and Istanbul and beyond. The process of acquiring, cataloging, and beginning to read these tablets took decades, and the reading is still ongoing. Cuneiform scholarship is a living field. New tablets are being published. Digital corpora have made it possible for scholars in different countries to work with the same material simultaneously in ways that were not possible before. The tablets that waited underground for millennia are still, in some sense, being read for the first time. That continuation, from pressing to drying to storage to burial to excavation to museum to scholarship to decipherment, is itself a kind of extended archival life. The tablet did not simply survive. It passed through a long chain of human hands and human attention, each link in that chain choosing, in its own way, to carry it forward. The curator who wrapped it in tissue. The scholar who spent a career on a single archive. The student who learned to read cuneiform signs the way Sumerian students once learned to press them. The chain is different from the one that originally created the record, but it is a chain, and it holds. The deeper survival of Sumerian culture through Old Babylonian copying deserves its own moment of quiet recognition. By the time those scribal schools were teaching Sumerian as a prestige language, Sumerian had already ceased to be the everyday speech of most people in the region. Akkadian had taken its place in ordinary life. And yet the hymns, the proverbs, the instructional texts, the compositions that Babylonian scholars valued enough to preserve, all of these continued to be copied, studied, and transmitted, not because anyone had decided to save them for posterity, but because copying them was part of what it meant to be educated. The survival was embedded in routine. It persisted not through exceptional effort but through the same mechanism that had sustained the archive from the beginning, the daily return to the same task, the same materials, the same deliberate marks in clay. What this suggests, sitting with it quietly at the end of a long story, is something that the archive itself never states but perhaps demonstrates more plainly than any other kind of document could. Human societies leave their deepest marks not necessarily in their loudest moments, not in their victories or their catastrophes or their most celebrated compositions, but in the things that had to be done every day regardless. The grain that had to be counted. The beer that had to be brewed. The ration that had to be allocated. The sign that had to be pressed correctly before the lesson could move forward. These are not the things that any civilization sets out to be remembered by. They are the things that simply could not stop, because if they stopped, the people depending on them would have nothing to eat that evening, and the archive would fall behind, and the students would not advance. The routine was the civilization, in ways that the exceptional moments only interrupted. And now, somewhere in a quiet gallery, the tablet is still there. Under the same kind of low, steady light it has sat under since it was cleaned and catalogued and placed behind glass. The marks on its surface are still as shallow as they were when they were pressed. The edge is still worn. The total, whatever it recorded, grain or animals or labor or goods, is still legible to the right eyes, still holding its number across the full distance of all that time. The person who pressed it into the clay went home that evening through the cooling streets of a city that no longer stands. Whatever they were thinking, whatever they carried with them when the day's work was done, is gone entirely. But the number remained. The clay held. And in holding, it carried something forward that was never meant to last, the trace of an ordinary day, pressed into the earth of the world's first cities, waiting in the dark for a long time before anyone came to read it again. The gallery is quiet. The tablet rests. Outside, the world continues in the way it always has, counting its goods, teaching its students, keeping its records, letting most of what matters pass without being written down.